you in the camera?
Yes.
Oh, over here. Hi, this is Jeff Boggs. This is Elsie. And this is the start of the week 2 lecture for Geography and Tourism Studies 2P21. Last week in Geography and Tourism Studies 2P21, because it was the beginning of the course, we covered Spickard's 6 steps for research design, which are being used to organize the way the material is taught and to scaffold your understanding and learning of how to write an annotated bibliography, a literature review, and a research proposal. After that, then we explored the relation between research topics and research questions, and even before that, we explored the relation between research problems and research topics. And I may have also hinted at the importance of literature reviews and why we need them. If I didn't do that, kind of keep that in mind as the course progresses, because that will come up again and again. One of the things that we learned last week that research design is a systematic, transparent, and reproducible plan for conducting research. So by research, we mean a way to collect data and then analyze it in order to answer a research question. So by systematic, you'll remember that meant that it was a stepwise logical process where you start somewhere and eventually end somewhere, that it's transparent so that it's clear to not only you but to other people what you are doing. And because it is systematic and transparent, it is also reproducible. And part of making it systematic and transparent is writing it down, which then also helps make it reproducible. So that was our working definition of a research design, which is the primary overarching skill that you're learning in this course. To jog your memory, we'll say a bit about Spickard's 6 steps, since those are being used to organize the course. His first was to develop a good research question, and this we discussed in lab and in lecture. So if your lab consists of a critic activity, then you will have developed some research questions, and we'll get some feedback on how effective those are. Then our second step, which is what we're going to focus on this week, is to develop a logical structure. And Spickard identifies 10. The third, and this is what we'll cover in week 3, is to identify the type of data you need that is appropriate for your logical structure, which in turn is appropriate to answer your research question. And Spickard identifies 14 types of data. In the fourth week, we'll talk about picking a data collection method, and Spickard identifies 12. Week 5, we'll talk about choosing your site and sampling strategy. So this is the 5th step. And in the 6th week, we'll talk about picking a data analysis method. And to reiterate, this week we are focusing on choosing a logical structure that is appropriate to your research question. In case you're lost, this means that you need to read Spickard's chapter 2 on logical structures to get the most out of this lecture and the course. What does Spickard mean when he says logical structure? The first thing to realize is that this term that he has, logical structure, is his term, and it's not common at all in the research design literature. So if you've had research design or research methodology courses before, you may not be familiar with that term. It's fine, but you'll want to develop a sense of what this means. And a logical structure is the format that you follow to answer your research question. And this makes more sense after you learn the 10 logical structures. So it's a kind of a format that you follow to answer your research question. And particular kinds of research questions usually require a particular, like a subset of logical structures. One way to think about a logical structure is that it is really what you have to do, or if you will, the kind of research you have to conduct to answer your research question. And this is really the key point, is that certain kinds of research questions require certain kinds of logical structures. So some research questions can't really be answered by many of the logical structures. So you first identify your research question. And once you've done that, then that points to usually a handful of the 10 logical structures. Only some smaller number, maybe 2 or 3 or 4, are actually appropriate for answering that research question. So that is, I think, the main thing to keep in mind. You want your research question and your logical structure to match each other. So to correspond to each other in a way that makes sense. And Spickard argues that there are 3 kind of broad categories or types of logical structures. So the first he defines as being useful for answering questions about relations between 2 or more things. And he identifies 4 logical structures, and these tend to be these tend to require kind of quantitative or numerical analysis. So that's the first 4. He also identifies a second type of logical structure that are basically research questions that are asking for what he refers to as detailed descriptions. And for this, he identifies 3 logical structures. And then the third category is this sort of grab bag or miscellaneous category. And so this third category includes questions that are they're questions that aren't asking about the relation or relations between 2 or more things, and they're also not asking for detailed descriptions. And there are 3 of those. The first type of logical structures that Spickard identifies are what I'm going to call type 1 logical structures. And these are questions about relations between 2 or more things. There are true experiments. There are quasi-experiments, ex post facto research, and correlational research. And of these, ex post facto and correlational research are the most common of these 4 in geography and tourism studies. So there are 4 logical structures that allow you to understand or to answer questions about relations between 2 or more things. And of these, ex post facto research and correlational research are the most common, though we will talk a bit about true experiments and quasi-experiments here in a few moments. If your question is basically of the form, does A affect B, or do C and D usually happen together, or what he refers to as do questions, which personally I don't like, but we'll stick with that. So these do questions are questions that need to be answered using one of these four logical structures. And a feature of these kinds of questions is where we have A and B or C and D, these are things called variables. So does temperature affect precipitation? Do high unemployment rates and low wages usually happen together? So we can substitute these letters for particular concepts that are measured in very specific ways, or also we can think of these as variables. So things that can be measured that vary in a measurable way. I suppose that's a bit redundant. We'll stick with it for now. The first logical structure that Spickard talks about are what he calls true experiments. And bear in mind that in both geography and in tourism study, these are very rare, largely because they require one being able to control the environment in which the experiment takes place. That's easier to do in laboratory conditions, but much more difficult to do if you go, say, outside, because you don't really have much control on what happens outside. Whereas if you're in a laboratory, it's much easier to control conditions within that laboratory. This then also gets at one of the big differences between sciences or disciplines that use true experiments. They use experimental data, so data that's been gathered through experiments, whereas a lot of other disciplines like geography and tourism study make use of data, especially quantitative data, that's observational data. So it's gathered in the world, but not under experimental conditions. Nonetheless, it's still useful to talk briefly about true experiments because these are so important in, say, medical research, for instance, or in some particular sciences like physics or chemistry, for instance. One of the benefits of true experiments are that they're the most reliable way to determine cause and effect. These experiments, they require at least two groups, an experimental group and a control group. And the point here is that both of these groups, both the experimental group and the control group, are substantially similar, if not identical. So once upon a time, I worked in I suppose you would say, it wasn't really a lab as much as a place where animals were kept. And these animals were axolotls. Axolotls are these cute little salamanders that originally were found around what is now Mexico City, but are pretty much locally extinct there. But at the time, I was about, how old was I? I was probably about 20 or 21 at the time when I had this university job where what I did was feed axolotls and mix huge buckets, like garbage cans really, of salt water for them because they needed a particular kind of water that had a particular salinity to it. And also you had to let the water sit for a couple of days for the chlorine to sort of come out of it. Anyway, these axolotls were then used in some sort of biological experiments. And the thing about these axolotls is that they had tracked, so each axolotl, each little salamander had its own bowl that it lived in, and on their bowls were then sort of a, for lack of better words, a kind of a social security number for each axolotl. And through this, they could identify what traits that axolotl had because the axolotls had been, if I remember correctly, sort of crossbred for many generations. And remember, these are salamanders, so they reproduce at least once a year and mature relatively quickly. So sort of like rats, experimental rats or lab rats, the gene lines for these organisms were fairly well understood, which then meant that they could be used in particular kinds of experiments in which they would say we need 100 axolotls that have this particular characteristic. So some of the axolotls were albinos. So if they were interested in the effect of lots of sunlight on the skin of albino axolotls, then they would order 100, some other lab somewhere in the world would order 100 axolotls, and they could then randomly assign 50 axolotls to a group that receives one treatment, so maybe exposure to ultraviolet light or to sunlight, and the other group, the control group, does not receive the experiment. And then what they do is, after you've randomly assigned these similar organisms to one of two groups, then you observe to see if there's any change that happens. So now, mind you, don't go burn down any labs that have axolotls. I'm sort of making what they were used for up. I was not a biology student. I was not a zoologist. I had this cool job basically in which I, got to make water, feed axolotls, and listen to loud music at 3 in the morning if I wanted to go into the lab then and work. So, but the point of this is that these creatures were being used either as experimental groups or control groups when they would be shipped off. And as I've intimated, or actually already stated, experimental groups receive the treatment, or sometimes this will be called an intervention, and the control group does not. So currently, we are in the middle of a COVID crisis as I narrate these slides. And so in the process of creating vaccines, one of the things that happens is that you try to find, a vaccine that's functional or that works. And so if you develop a vaccine that you think is effective against COVID, you usually want to test it beforehand. And so you might, in that instance, get a pool of, a few hundred people who are otherwise somewhat similar in age and in health conditions and many other factors as possible. And then you randomly assign them, randomly allocate them to one group or the other. The group that gets the treatment would get the experimental COVID vaccine, and the other group would get a placebo. So both groups would get injections, but only one group actually gets the treatment, and the other group gets basically saline liquid, which has no actual effect, right? If then there's any difference that's observed between the two groups after the intervention, so that is after one group receives the COVID vaccine, the experimental COVID vaccine, and the other group receives the placebo, if there's any difference between those two groups, because the two groups were already similar, if not identical, the argument gets made that if there are any differences, these differences have resulted from the use of this intervention, or in this case, this experimental COVID vaccine, right? So you probably are already generally familiar with this notion of experiments that are conducted in this way. And how we interpret outcomes in an experiment is if there's no differences between the two groups after the intervention, this means that the intervention had no effect. So if people were being exposed to COVID sort of on an experimental basis after they received the vaccine or the placebo, and it was found that there was no difference in the probability of contracting COVID for either of those groups, then that would suggest that there's no effect, so that the vaccine is not effective. But this logic works in a lot of other cases as well, where there are experiments. In the social sciences, psychology is really the only discipline that relies on true experiments. Occasionally, there are economists that make use of experiments, but they're still not very common. So, the second group of logical structures that Spicker defines are quasi-experiments. These are rare in geography and tourism studies, and just pay attention when I say GTS on the slides, that's just short for geography and tourism studies. So quasi-experiments are rare in geography and tourism studies, but they're still relatively more common than actual honest-to-God experiments. Sometimes quasi-experiments get referred to as natural experiments. And I suppose they're called natural experiments because they're sort of unplanned. They refer to a case in which there's an unanticipated intervention, or the natural experiment. So this occurs, and researchers then are able to take advantage of it. And your textbook provides a couple of interesting examples of this, making use of educational interventions that were unplanned. And what happens here that's different, one of the things that happens that's different from a real experiment or from a true experiment, is that individuals are not deliberately allocated at random to the two groups. I suppose a contemporary example of this in the time of COVID is that currently my daughter is going to school in an environment where they are practicing social distancing. Some of her friends, their parents, have decided to not send their children to school where they have face-to-face contact, but are instead engaging in online learning. This could be thought of as a natural experiment. So some children are learning in a face-to-face environment, granted one in which social distancing is being practiced, and another group are learning at home in an online environment. That, I assure you, is a situation which many researchers will be examining for the next decades to come as natural experiments to see if there are differences between how people learn or what they learn, or maybe their effect of online versus non-online learning, on children's career trajectories or over the course of their life, right? So you and I are currently engaged possibly in a natural experiment in the sense that at Brock, pretty much all courses are online, but some universities have decided, for better or for worse, to have in-person classes. And so it's possible that in the future, in the sort of appropriate ministries at the provincial level, whose names keep changing every time there's a new government, they might identify students who attended universities where there was online learning and universities where there was face-to-face learning to try to see if there was any kind of difference in career trajectories or other kinds of outcomes between people based on whether or not they were at an in-person or an online learning environment. Another example that comes from the Canadian case from about 20 years ago involves the impact of stress on early childhood development. And in particular, it focuses on a set of, I guess there was this was before I moved to Canada, but there was a very large snowstorm in Quebec that shut down power in some places for up to 6 weeks. So that then, and through those 6 weeks, women were still having children. And the argument was that, or I guess the natural experiment was that, do we see systematic differences between children who are born during a very stressful period versus those who are born during a quote unquote more normal period? And because the argument is that as sort of stress hormones in mothers are raised, that then this can have an impact on both fetuses, but also on children as they're born into a stressful environment. And I'm not going to go into a lot of that research, but that is a really famous Canadian example from the last 20 years of a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment. And what it did find is that it seems that for children born in really stressful environments, then they tend to have different sorts of life outcomes to the degree that you can measure someone's life outcome for something that happened around 20 years ago, that they tend to have worse outcomes than people who were born in a less stressful environment. Okay, let's move on to the third one. So quasi-experiments are useful for establishing cause and effect, but because you're not controlling for all the possible variables or things that could cause a difference between your experimental group and your control group, they are not as reliable as true experiments. And they often rely on what I'll call serendipity to spot when they are actually taking place. So unlike true experiments, which are planned in advance, quasi-experiments, the experiment part of the quasi-experiment happens largely outside of the control of humans and is only recognized after the fact, after it has already happened. So if we think in terms of the Quebec example with the effects of a 6-week-long snowstorm and resulting loss of electricity and stress that this caused to children in the womb as well as in their early weeks of life, that nobody thought of that beforehand, right? That was only identified after the fact, after it already happened. And this then also points to the importance of cutoff dates in identifying natural experiments. So in the case of the Quebec example, the cutoff date is basically the beginning of the snowstorm until its effects, its initial effects at least, so until the electricity came back on 6 weeks later in some cases. Those are your cutoff dates. And then what you would do is you would follow children born during that time, and you would compare them to children born perhaps the previous year at the same time, so that you're controlling in that case for seasonality. And then you would also match them up with children born to mothers of similar socioeconomic and other status. So you would try then to identify a control group. So that would have been what had happened before the quasi-experiment. And then those children who suffered through that 6 weeks are the experimental group, basically. So that's how you can think then of cutoff dates is a really key thing that you need to find if you want to observe or if you want to use a natural experiment. Spickard's third logical structure is what he calls ex post facto research. Ex post facto is Latin for essentially after the fact. So it means that whatever you're studying has already happened. And this is actually quite common in geography and tourism studies. So remember, GTS stands for Geography and Tourism Studies. And in ex post facto research, we have some sort of outcome, something has happened, and we see what its cause might be after it has happened. And a common example of data that gets used for this might be things like Statistics Canada data. Like true experiments and quasi-experiments, ex post facto research tries to determine why, for instance, two different groups might differ. So one example might be to use Statistics Canada data to look at life expectancies across 2 or more different locations, and then attempt to determine what are the factors associated with longer or shorter, or let's say longer life expectancies. So, are places that are poorer, do they tend to have lower life expectancies? Are places that are more rural, do they tend to have lower life expectancies? So we attempt to assess whether there's an association, whether two things tend to vary together with ex post facto research. And ex post facto research often makes use of something called regression analysis, which you'll learn about if you take the stats course, Geography 3P22, or if you've actually had statistics in high school, there's a good chance that you might have at least touched on bivariate regression, if not also multivariate regression. And these are mathematical techniques that allow you to establish how likely it is that two sets of variables, both a dependent and an independent variable, how well they or how frequently they are associated together and how strong that association is. So as I'd mentioned before, Statistics Canada census data, surveys that students have conducted, for instance, in Peterborough themselves, or meteorological data, traffic data, there's all kinds of numerical data that can be used in this for ex post facto research. And again, this is quite common in geography and in tourism studies. Another feature that you want to keep in mind is that unlike true experiments or quasi-experiments, ex post facto research is not able to establish causality. So it's just because two things are associated with each other. So just because poor places happen to have lower life expectancies doesn't necessarily mean that there's a causal connection there. It doesn't mean that being poor necessarily causes shorter life expectancies, even though that certainly makes a lot of sense. But it's difficult to say that to the same degree is true. It's difficult to support that position with ex post facto research when it's in comparison to, say, a true experiment or even a quasi-experiment. The fourth logical structure that Spickard identifies is what he calls correlational research. Now, correlational research is common in geography and tourism studies, though I'm not sure how often you would use it in Peterborough. It just depends on the kinds of data that you collect. So remember, this requires quantitative data. So if you're going to use correlational research, that would be pretty common for physical geographers, and less so for human geographers and tourism studies students, though again it depends upon the exact nature of your research question in the case of Peterborough. If you've heard of scatter plots or Pearson's R, so Pearson's R is one of a family of correlation coefficients. A correlation coefficient like Pearson's R is a number that is used to summarize the general pattern that we see in a scatter plot. And a scatter plot is, here's an example of a scatter plot. This tends to be referred to as the x-axis. This tends to be called the y-axis. And what this allows you to do is to measure two different variables for the same observation. So if we were thinking about life expectancy and wealth, so are communities that are wealthy, do their inhabitants tend to live longer? This would be one way to investigate that. So in this case, X could refer to mean household income. So average household income, I'm just going to call it H income, I-N-C-O-M-E. Sorry about that. Okay, and then over here is going to be mean age at death. So on average, how old are people when they die? And in this instance, this could refer, this dot, would be one location. So that could be a town. This dot over here would be another town. That dot would be a town. That dot could be a town. That dot could be a town, and so on. And if there is a pattern like this is called a positive association. So in general, as household income gets bigger, right? So we're measuring that in Canadian dollars. That's supposed to be a dollar sign. As household income gets bigger in a community, on average, the mean age at death, so the average age at death, tends to increase. So that's a simple example of correlational research. Correlational research checks to see if A and B are associated, or do they vary together, is another way to think of this. So associated is the word that you'll see used frequently with this. And if these two variables, so in our instance, if household income and mean age of death did not vary or systematically or were not associated, this would be called independence. That means that in that case, household income would have no impact on mean age at death. And what that would look like in a scatter plot would be, when we think in terms of correlational research, it's useful to think, to actually draw arrows, to conceptualize or imagine how one thing might be associated or cause another thing to happen. So the three common examples are, A causes B, B causes A, or C causes both A and B. let's kind of walk through these. So if we use the example of headaches and storms, this first example here, A causes B, A could be the headache, B could be the storm. So somehow someone has a headache and that causes a storm to happen. And I'm using this example because I live with someone who frequently gets headaches when there are storms. So this first example, headaches cause storms to happen. In comic books, with superheroes, sure, that's likely to happen. Or, if we're thinking in terms of fairy tales, like, Baba Yaga, yeah, maybe. Second example might be that B causes A. So in this case, storms cause headaches. Maybe one theorizes that loud lightning strikes associated with storms, are very loud and annoying and cause dogs to bark and children to wail, and people who have to sort of live in those situations get a headache as a result of these sort of these events that are being caused by the storm. So this, we could think of it as an example of B causing A, or we could turn to this case here in which C causes A and B to both happen. So C in this case is actually an example of what typically gets called a lurking, that's a R, not an N, a lurking variable. So in this case, headaches and storms are actually caused by changes in air temperature. So changes in air temperature are picked up in people's sinuses, in their eardrums, can trigger headaches in sensitive individuals. Also, changes in air pressure can lead storms to occur when you have sort of high and low pressure areas colliding with each other, right? So these are examples. In this case with C is an example of a lurking variable. So one thing that you have to be aware of with correlational research is that you have good reasons to believe that A and B might be connected directly. And if you think there's a lurking variable, you should try to figure out how to measure that as well. Another example of this would be the relationship between crime and ice cream. So we've got crime and ice cream. So, and I believe Spickard actually talks about this. So crime and ice cream sales tend to accompany each other. So higher crime takes place when ice cream sales tend to increase, at least in some places. So it could be that people eat ice cream, they get a brain freeze, and then immediately they go out on a crime spree and steal the first bicycle they see, or run naked down the street streaking, or behave in otherwise unlawful manners. Though I suppose streaking depends upon where you're located. Anyway, whether that's unlawful or not. It could also be that crime causes an increased demand in ice cream, and actually the way this would work is that ice cream is such an addictive substance that once people become addicted to ice cream, they have to commit crimes. So they steal small children's bicycles or wagons off of porches or hubcaps off of cars. And they do this to feed their ice cream habit, right? So, or it could be that there's a lurking variable. So typically what happens is that ice cream sales and crime tends to be higher in the summertime. So in the summertime, more people are out, and one way people deal with being out in the summertime is They consume ice cream. And another thing that happens when more people are out and about is that there are more opportunities for basically opportunistic crimes to take place. So, I might notice, hey, look, there's a bicycle that nobody has chained up, and suddenly ride off with it, and I'm now the unlawful owner of a new bicycle. So you might then, this headaches and storms example of lurking variable isn't so, it doesn't stick in your mind so much, you might instead think of, crime, ice cream, and summertime as an example, where summer and especially summer temperatures are really the cause for, or are maybe not the cause, but are associated both with more crime and more ice cream sales. Now at this point, we've covered the 4 kinds of type 1 logical structures. So these are, one way to think about it, these are logical structures that allow you to answer what Spickard refers to as do questions, which drives me crazy, but maybe that will stick in your mind. But let's talk about how they're similar and how they're different. So all 4 of them examine either causality, that's cause and effect, or the relations or associations between things, and in this case, things means variables. All 4 are quantitative, which means that they require numbers or some kind of numerical data, or at the very least, data that can be ranked in an ordinal sense, and we'll cover what that means later on in this semester. In geography and tourism studies, the first 2 kinds of these logical structures, so that is true experiments and quasi-experiments, they're rare in geography and tourism studies for reasons that I talked about earlier. The last 2, however, are common. So this would be ex post facto research and correlational research. At this point, I want to turn to what we can call type 2 questions. So these are questions that are asking for detailed descriptions. These are descriptive research, case studies, and historical studies, if we make use of Spickard's conceptualization of these. So descriptive research, case studies, historical studies. So an example might be, what does variable E look like in a small city? So what does dog ownership look like in a small city? What does crime look like in a small city? What do ice cream consumption patterns look like in a small city? Or what happened in the case of F? So what happened when free ice cream was distributed? Or what happened when a dog park was closed down? Or what happened when students had to learn online? These are all what questions, which is a sort of I suppose is slightly better than calling them do questions, but that might help you keep in mind that what these have in common. And unlike the type 1, the type 2 questions, so descriptive research, case studies, historical studies, those 3 logical structures, can rely on qualitative data alone, quantitative data alone, or a combination of the 2. And the fancy term for the combination of qualitative and quantitative data is mixed methods research. We'll leave it at that for now. Descriptive research is the 5th logical structure that Spickard describes. And this is quite common in geography and tourism studies, whether people are more focused on sort of the natural sciences or the social sciences or even humanities adjacent kinds of research questions. One of the things to bear in mind with descriptive research is that you're less interested in sort of describing or attempting to capture cause and effect, and you're really more interested in coming up with a rich description of what is happening in a particular context. Descriptive research focuses generally on the contemporary time, so basically now, or the recent past. In part, this is because descriptive research will often rely on data collection techniques where you collect primary data through either interviewing people or surveying or taking measurements in real time, that if you don't capture those around the time they happen, then you'll lose any evidence that these experiences actually took place. So if you want to understand, for instance, patterns of rainfall and how they change over time, which is really a descriptive research question, you need some sort of way to capture rainfall data. So either you start now and work your way into the future, or you get lucky and you happen to find a weather station that has recorded rainfall data for you on a daily basis for the past however many years, or some combination of the two. Often descriptive research focuses on many cases, and one way to think about this is that there will be many observations. So if we were thinking in terms of rainfall, we would be collecting data from many weather stations. If you recall Spickard's examples from the textbook, he had two examples, and one discussed, asking students questions about how they played. So it wasn't one student, it was students from two different elementary schools, one in California and one in Michigan. And so that research involved interviewing, surveying lots of students. And the other one that Spickard talks about involves speaking to a range of teachers in a school district in the south or southwest of England, as I recall. And in that case, the teachers were interviewed. So it wasn't one teacher, it was multiple teachers. So this is what we mean by a focus on many cases. Case studies are the sixth logical structure identified by Spickard. These are also common in geography and tourism studies, but they differ from descriptive studies in that they tend to focus on one or a handful of cases, often showing how a general social process works in one context. So an example of this might be in my dissertation research, I interviewed book publishers in two different cities, and in both cities I asked how they acquired manuscripts. And so that allowed me to understand how do book publishers in Frankfurt am Main or in Berlin, how do they get manuscripts that they then decide whether they want to turn into a book or not. And that allowed me to understand the role of literary agents and the slush pile and personal networks and sort of virtue signaling and a few other mechanisms whereby book publishers and especially editors could sift through the avalanche of manuscripts they got to find ones that they thought would be worth publishing. If you're interested in case studies, Robert Yin is the guru of case studies. And I believe this text, Case Study Research Design and Methods 3rd edition, should be available through the Brock Library online, because Sage is the publishing house, and Sage is actually quite good at publishing competent works that deal with how to conduct particular kinds of research. So if you are interested in case studies, you might give Yin's work a look-see. The seventh example of logical structures that Spickard identifies is what he calls historical research. It also is common in geography and tourism studies. And you might actually argue that a lot of sort of paleoclimate work or work on climate change and historical climate change could be fit under this category. It might deal with many cases, so in that way it's actually more like descriptive, so you might think of descriptive historical research, or it might be a case study, so it just looks at one particular context, and in that case you might think of it in terms of historical case study research. But for our purposes, we're going to lump those together. And the sort of the gist, the key point of historical research is that it describes events or processes that happened in the past. But then this also implies that you have some way of assessing conditions in the past. So if we think about climate research often involves taking cores, so basically drilling a hole into something and extracting that core and then measuring the composition of chemicals within that core, whether it be an ice core or a core from a tree. Though actually with trees, you also then tend to count the fatness or the width of the rings as well as how many rings there are to get a sense of not only how old the tree is, but how many years ago was there a drought and things like that. But the point about historical research is you need some way to assess conditions in the past. So this could be something like you look at old real estate records or you look at old newspapers. So, but you need some way to understand or what happened in the past. And because we don't have a time machine, we have to rely on other proxy methods of getting at understanding what happened in the past. And here, archival records are really common. So public property records would be an example of this, or birth certificates. I suppose if you were interested in criminal behavior, if you could get a hold of court records, basically any kind of paper trail can be quite useful here. I've looked at bankruptcies before to understand sort of the death of a particular firm in the video game industry. So there are all kinds of archival records that can be used. Now, if you're in Peterborough, this part of the goal of your experience in Peterborough is to force you to collect primary data. And so in theory, archival records can be treated as primary data, but in our experience, most of the time, students are going to end up collecting data that is not archival. So it's useful to know about this, but you want to think about how useful it's going to be if you only have 3 days to collect archival records, right? Okay. In terms of these type 2 logical structures, so descriptive research, case study research, and historical research, we want to think briefly about how are they similar and how are they different from each other. So they all describe things or events, often how things seem to have happened or been experienced by those who experience them. They might rely on quantitative data. They might rely, so remember that's numerical data. They might rely on qualitative data. Sort of a useful shorthand for qualitative data is to think of that as words. Or they might rely on a combination of both quantitative and qualitative data. So they might be examples of mixed research or mixed methods research. And in geography and tourism studies, all three, so descriptive research, case study research, historical research, these are all common logical structures. The third type of logical structure that Spickard talks about are three disparate logical structures that only fit together because I needed to put them all in a basket to sort of speed this along. So the first one of these three logical structures is something called longitudinal research. Longitudinal research examines something and how it changes over time. So it might be that you're interested in how property values in a particular neighborhood change over time. And so, every year you look at the property assessment records in that neighborhood, and you do that for 50 years, and you have data for maybe every house over those 50 years, assuming those houses were all there over 50 years. And so that could be an example of longitudinal research. It might be that you go back to the same creek every month and take samples of macroinvertebrates, that's a fancy word for water bugs, and in the process of doing that, you develop if you will, a picture over time of how the populations of these aquatic insects and actually quite small organisms, how that changes over time, maybe as a result of seasonality or as a result of pollution being dumped into the water or changes in rain, something like that. But the main point about longitudinal research is that you have one thing or a couple of things you're interested in, and you repeatedly measure those over time and observe changes over time. So longitudinal research is really about answering the question of what happens over time. There's something called meta-analysis, which gets at, what conclusions can we draw if we combine previous studies. You're not going to do this for Peterborough, and in fact, it requires usually quantitative studies. So this doesn't happen much in geography and tourism studies because the kinds of quantitative analysis that takes place in the previous studies has to be similar enough that you can compare that over time. And this, I would not say that geography and tourism studies, especially human geography, less so in physical geography. And it's possible that in some sort of subspecializations of tourism study, this might work as well. But in general, I would not in any case expect to see anybody do this in Peterborough. But it's useful to know what it is because occasionally in your literature reviews, you'll come across a meta-analysis. And then there's something called action research. So that's action research. Spickard sort of summarizes as asking the question of how do we implement change? So some interesting action research right now in the fall of 2020 might be how do we most effectively teach 2P21 students how to write a literature review? That would be a topic for action research. However, action research is generally not the kind of research that gets completed in Peterborough as well. And even longitudinal research is unlikely to be taking place in Peterborough unless you're measuring something over 3 days. So, and we'll leave that at that, okay? Spickard's 8th logical structure is longitudinal research. It's common in physical and population geography. So, for instance, we might look at a neighborhood or a census tract or a watershed and measure the same thing over have repeated measures over time and see what kinds of patterns or trends emerge. In general, longitudinal research requires that you establish some baseline, and often you have to sort of justify this baseline. So, why did I pick 1952 as the time to begin recording data? Hopefully my justification is more than that's when it started, though in some cases that can still be useful if it's, say, in 1957, something really big and important happened that altered trends from then on out. Then this baseline, like if we go back even before the baseline starts, it gives us a sense of the sort of magnitude of change that might have taken place. In any case, once we've got a baseline, and if you were using Statistics Canada data, if it were drawn from the census, you would generally be using data at least as far back as 1971 that was collected every 5 years, because the census comes out every 5 years. So you then continue measurements into the future with the same people or on the same features. So in this class, we could begin a longitudinal research project in which I attempt to measure the impact of you learning to write a research proposal into the future. So, you learn it this semester, and then next year I could interview you and ask you how you found that helpful or not helpful, and then keep doing that every year for the next 10 years as an example of a longitudinal research design. And my goal in that case would be to figure out how useful is this. I think it's a fairly useful skill to learn, but I don't have any data that I've collected myself that actually confirms that supposition, right? One of the tricky things about longitudinal research is that it requires sufficient funding and interest to conduct this research over years or even decades. So, if a problem that can happen with some longitudinal research projects is that the lead researcher gets bored, or that they lose their funding to support the research, or they're hit by a bus and they pass away. All kinds of things can happen like that. Sometimes researchers will move to a different university or research institute, and that can lead to the disruption in how they collect their data. So one of the things about longitudinal research is that it requires a commitment and some stability to make sure that you can, I guess, make it worth your while to collect the data. Spickard's ninth logical structure is called a meta-analysis. And nowadays, the term meta is much more commonly used in kind of a colloquial sense, whereas when I was your age, it was only used in a really kind of obscure academic sense. But a meta-analysis is really rare in geography and tourism studies. I think the only places that you might see it would be in particular branches of, say, tourism management, perhaps in particular kinds of quantitative transportation geography, and probably in some kinds of physical geography research. And what meta-analysis does is that it puts together many already published smaller but similar studies and combines them. And in particular, these are studies in which the same kinds of quantitative techniques or very similar quantitative techniques were being used, so that comparison is that much easier. It also then allows for, if you can get hold of the original data, allows you to combine all of these observations into a larger sample size. Then you can also then control for the fact that they're actually from different studies, but it can reveal more subtle quantitative patterns. And most of the time, for meta-analysis to be worth its while, you need research that was conducted under either the real experiments or the quasi-experiment logical structure. One of my colleagues, Dragoș Simonton, really likes to find meta-analysis research. He tends to sort of read even further afield than most geographers, and he has an interest in psychology, and so at times he will, in neuroscience, and so at times he will, over the years, has told me about, oh, I read this interesting meta-analysis in such and such. So it's possible that you might come across a meta-analysis in your own research, but I wouldn't expect you to conduct one for the geography or tourism studies field course in Peterborough. The 10th logical structure is action research. And at least for the Peterborough course, it's fairly rare in geography and tourism studies students. I don't think it would be impossible, but most of the time, given that you're only in Peterborough collecting data for 3 days, I don't see action research as something that you would want to do. Now, however, if you were working on a thesis project or you were on an internship, it's possible, or at a job, it's possible that action research might actually be really helpful. And what action research does is it describes the process of creating a change and then measuring if that change worked as anticipated. So, for instance, I could attempt action research on on 2P21. And I suppose in a very vague sense I do, in that I tweak the course every year, try to make it better and see what works and what doesn't work. So we could think of that as action research, even though it's never actually produced a paper or any kind of like written research out of it. And part of the goal in this course is to learn how to develop a transparent, systematic, and reproducible research plan that you then can go and implement. So it might be that sort of the way I go about writing postmortems on what happened each week in a course isn't necessarily sufficient to be classified as action research. One of the things that I find really compelling about action research is that it usually involves learning how to do things and what does and does not work. So in that sense, it's a really practical skill set or a way of approaching problems. In the textbook, Spicker describes a plan, act, observe, reflect model. So you come up with a plan, you implement the plan, you observe the effects of the plan, and then you reflect on whether what actually happened was what you wanted to happen, and where there are also unanticipated things that happened that might be good or might be bad. And I would argue that of all the techniques, or I guess all of the logical structures that you'll encounter in this course, that even though you won't use this in Peterborough, that if you keep this in mind, that this is potentially the most useful for your career. Because it helps you just come up with basically a procedure for trying something new and then deciding whether it works or not. And so here I want to talk about what are the similarities and differences of type 3 logical structures. But before I do that, I'd like to briefly say something about another kind of something that might be classified as action research from somebody, a geographer I met a couple of years ago. And so this geographer, she said that she was sick of sort of the dating scene, and then decided that as an experiment, she was just going to go out with a lot of people and see what it was like. And in part, that helped build up like calibrate for herself, I think, an understanding of, you know, being able to determine whether she did or didn't like somebody. And so most of the time she'd go out for coffee with people, and then like after that, you know, they never met again. And that was in a way a kind of action research. And eventually she found somebody that she really did like. But in the process of doing that, she also learned how to, you know, not just assess her own feelings about sort of meeting people, but also to become comfortable with meeting people and not taking it as a personal insult if they, you know, didn't call her back or anything. So that is might be thought of as an example of action research that if she had also then you know, kept a little checklist, she might have been able to turn into a paper. So, but okay, let's come to this slide now. So what are the similarities and differences of type 3 logical structures? So honestly, there's not a lot of similarities between these three. We're talking about longitudinal research, we're talking about meta-analyses, and we're talking about action research. So those three are not, beyond the fact that they're ways to structure research, they don't really share a lot of similarities. And of these, only one is really common in geography and tourism studies, and that would be longitudinal analysis. At this point, we can review the 10 logical structures. So first are true experiments. For that, you might think of sort of medical research, or the kind of research that you would hope would be used to determine whether, say, a COVID-19 vaccine works or not. Second are quasi-experiments. So an example of that would be the case in Quebec in which there was a snowstorm which caused electrical outages for around 6 weeks, and that allowed researchers to later observe the differences, the developmental differences in children born during that time with children who were not born during a natural disaster. There's ex post facto research, so true experiments and quasi-experiments, neither are all that common in, I would actually say both are, so true experiments are very rare and quasi-experiments are rare in geography and tourism studies, whereas ex post facto research and correlational research are both common in geography and tourism studies. And one way to think, actually the border between the two can sometimes break down, but for correlational research, you know, you want to think in terms of, is there a scatter plot or not? If there's a scatter plot, it's probably some kind of correlational research or bleeds into correlational research. And these first four are all require quantitative data, that is numerical data. We then have descriptive research, which that tends to focus on contemporary or the recent past, and it's not interested so much in understanding cause and effect as just describing what happened, and often with rich descriptions. There are case studies, so they share some similarities with descriptive research, but tend to dive down into a smaller number of observations. There's historical research. So frankly, there can be historical descriptive research and historical case study research, but for our purposes, we're just going to call it historical. Longitudinal research, so that's where you take repeated measures over time and assess long-term patterns or trends. There's meta-analysis, so that is where you take numerous other quantitative studies that use similar techniques and analyze similar kinds of problems, and you recombine them so that they are then basically can give you a more nuanced statistical analysis. And then the last is action research, which is essentially a plan or a way of conducting research so you can understand whether you are making changes that have the intended consequences that you wish for them to have.